properties. I want to use the meeting owl mic. All right, now we have audio as well. So, John, take it away.
Except I'm going to take it away.
Oh, you're okay.
I'm going to do an introduction. There has been a certain amount, I think, of confusion and lack of information that we've shared on this, and so I think it's going to really help if initially I give a little bit of an overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to John, and hopefully we have what you want. Emo was out. We didn't have a chance to ask many questions about what was most useful in this room today.
So, on YouTube.
What? Oh, we have a problem?
On YouTube. They see the chat, not the...
Well, that's funny.
We're just fixing the stream real fast. Sorry.
Actually, that's a good point. Let me
That's
try
why I push pause.
Fix this. Which is very funny. Why is that happening? Oh, because I see what the problem is. I see what the problem is. I see what the problem is. Bum bum bum.
Pretty sure the problem is streaming is hard.
No, the problem is that
Emo went on vacation and forgot how to do his job.
He's still on vacation. He's just corporeally here. Not reporting it.
Did we have this problem last week?
I don't know because we haven't tried uploading the videos yet.
this should fix this. All right.
And we're looking okay now?
Yeah.
All right, okay. So, at any rate, I'll try to keep this fairly short, but I wanted to start with the most basic passion we have about this project, which is that authors of anything, command line, either input or output, anything, should not have to work very hard to give a fantastic user experience to their end user. Our user is not the potentially tens of thousands of people that might ever use it from an operating point of view. Our passion is ultimately around the millions of people that may be able to use that. So we're gonna talk about the authoring experience today, but I think it's helpful to understand that our real passion goes one step beyond that. And the second thing is we're gonna talk about parsing today, but it is the most grown up, it's the one ready to go. However, we think it's also one of the not most important. We think the most important part of this is opening up VT100 and some better abstractions across the output side of it, the rendering, the terminal side. System console is pretty weak on some stuff on that, and we are working across the company with that and Windows Terminal. And on all of this, especially on the rendering side, we are part of an ecosystem, and we are very much interested in solving it from an ecosystem point of view. And there's been some people that have misunderstood that, and I'd like to make sure that we sort of get that off the table. We are, and do you want to go to our notes? That's kind of went through this. That's our passion, and this is some of the areas that we're working in. So,
could you give an example of rendering problem? Like you said, it's a big problem.
Okay, I'm going to ask John to do that. There's going to be times we're not going to be a PM, we're going to be a dev. So that's a dev. Let's give a dev answer to that one.
So I think the short version there is that System.console wasn't originally designed to work on virtual terminals on Linux and Mac. And what's in place now is a bit of a shim, and it breaks down in a few different places. The abstraction is kind of hard to use in some cases because if you want to write output and console output has been redirected, the expectation is you're writing to plain text non-UTF output, UTF-8. In practice, though, with virtual terminals and in the Mac and Linux world, you're probably writing to a terminal that understands ANSI output. And these mixed modes, there's no programming model really to understand what mode you're in, to understand what kind of terminal you're in, and whether output has been redirected. It's always up to the end user to figure this out. So things that are fairly common gestures in terminal usage, such as redirecting output, will blow up a lot of kinds of command line applications. As well, if you are piping output from one command line tool to another, the inability to communicate across them as to what kind of output you're looking for, ANSI output versus non-ANSI output is one example. How you want text to lay out on the screen. You know, if I have a dir, the directory application that is going to write out output, and I want it to be ANSI enabled, but then I go and redirect output. Even if I've correctly detected that output is redirected, I'm likely to spit a whole bunch of ANSI escape characters into a file, which is ultimately not useful. So these are the kinds of problems that exist in that space. So what we're aiming to do there is to, by convention, detect terminal capabilities, allow people to write code exactly once that structures the output in the way that they want it to, and do the right thing based on the terminal capabilities, as well as be able to communicate this across command line tools via a kind of content negotiation type of concept.
And from a PM point of view, it would have been, I want that to be blue, and I don't want to have to tell you how to make it blue. So that's another level at which we're looking at this. Okay. So I want to go on past console, but I wanted to talk about that as the fact that we actually see this as a super important place in the future. The structure of this project has been to be open source. It's been a side project almost exclusively. And the beginning of that, I think is worth mentioning. So, first of all, people have implied that we didn't look at other parsers, and that's simply not true. So we did look at other parsers. We did find some real, and we'll talk about why we think that the approach that we're taking is important. But let's start out by saying that yes, we did look at other parsers. And one of the things that happened in that is that I stood up at the MVP Summit 2 years ago, and I said we were working on this. And I was a PM standing on stage who didn't understand all the details, couldn't have given a good answer even if I wanted to, and it was time to go on. And Mark Michaelis raised his hand, and he said, many of you know Mark Michaelis, and he said, in great Mark Michaelis, very short and to the point fashion, he said, please don't write another command line parser. And I said, feedback taken, went on with the discussion. Afterwards, John walked up to, spent 5 minutes talking to him. Mark walked up to me, and he said, not only should you do this, I will help you find a team. And so Mark has been our external sponsor through his company Intellitech. He has brought us devs, open source devs, people that volunteered. He has co-sponsored the 3 hackathons that we did that were very important in stating direction. We got some code written, but the really important thing is that helped us hone in through members of the community that were a total of people who have contributed to this through a hackathon or not is 50?
Something like that, yeah.
Around 50. So we have very much been, we have reached out at that level, not so much to always to experts, to people who are actually the users. Although Nate McMaster was also important at the beginning part of this. We reached out to him. He also agreed that we wanted to take a step forward. There's been some changes since then in how he's supporting his tool, and we want to work with him on what he's doing as well as everybody there. So I don't want to feel defensive about that, but I also believe it's really important to lay that as a groundwork that we absolutely want to work inside the community. And if we can't convince you that we are doing interesting things that other parsers aren't, then that's a different conversation. But I really want to start with that to have an open mind here. So can you scroll that up? Because we're saying down to Mark Michaelis. We put Mark Michaelis near the top. Okay, so the big thing that's missing is a syntax abstraction. So basically, we're focused in, the base core part is the Roslyn for CLI, and that's really kind of a hooky way to say it. It's more of a PM than a dev way to say it. But there is very discrete items that represent the syntax pieces of CLI, which are obviously way simpler. So options, arguments, commands, this is all part of a structured API which lies at the core. From a simplistic point of view, parsers are often written because the person needs to get a job done. Many of the parsers that people have been written, I need to get something done. They effectively, because of that, wrote it from the outside in. This is what I want, this is how I'm going to accomplish it. Because we had access to resources that have written 5 on your part, how many parsers have you written in .NET? 3?
You mean tools using a parser?
How many actual parsers, like the .NET parser, the other parsers? This is long history. My point is that we have written a lot of parsers in this building, and we're drawn on that. We're saying, okay, there's some things we got right and some things we got wrong. And I started into this because for .NET tools, I went in, I tried to create something. I said, what parser should I use? Somebody suggested I use the one in the .NET CLI. I went in, I looked at that, I said it's completely unusable, and I went through my process of going through several parsers. So, couple things right now, just it is layered. The API we're going to show you is intended to sit under app models, and many people will use app models. Our proof of concept is Dragonfruit, although we think there's a long way to go after that. So just a few features. I don't think these are really the core of this, but the point is, can you scroll down so we can see all the features? So let's make that, yeah, this whole section right here. Yeah, so some things are expected, some things are sometimes occur in other parsers. But because our passion is about that end user, these are our non-options. This is our can't do without, is these things right in here. So you write a parser, you have help. You write a parser, you have tab completion suggestions. There's a small asterisk on that because you still have to get it into the shell. The end user always has to get it into the shell. But for system command line, you get into the shell once. And then all system command line applications feed through that. And so it's not once for every command line app, it's once, period. And that is a protocol we'd like to share. So we hope that's going to go beyond that. Linux, POSIX, whether you have slash or dash dash, all that, we're working to make that as little as possible, as little as possible from the point of view of the author. One thing I'm missing here that we're not saying is that there's certain things that the end user should define, not the author. And so there's various things along that line. We get into that more on the rendering side. So there's things about how rich the output should be is one of the things that would be from the point of view of the end user, not the point of view of the author. So we've got some things that are for authors. This is some of the places we're going. This is really important to us, both GUI and vision impaired, but we're set up for that. This is basically saying that we can output your definition or your parse result in whatever format you want. And so what's important is that we be able to take that definition and put it out for JAWS 2 or whatever reader support we're trying to do. And we're not going to do anything like big. We're just going to give the output that's needed for a reader to be able to fully support this. We actually think with what Rich Turner is doing, we might eventually get so that a CLI application is one of the easiest and most basic ways to build a completely vision-free application for all the places that might be interesting. So this is super important to us. It's part of our passion. One part of it may be used quite soon, but this is kind of where we're coming from. I've gone through a bunch of this. I'm about to stop, but if you scroll down just a little bit, I want to talk about where we want to go and where we are, and then this nothing below that matters. So, point of view today. This should be indented. Sorry about that, but we don't think we need to be in the BCL right now. We don't know if we should ever be, but we have this great model in the Immutable collections where we had something that was supported but not inside the BCL. That's the vision that we currently have of where we would like to be, why we're having the conversations today.
And what's the definition of in the BCL?
What? We don't know.
What do you mean by it? It's not in the BCL.
Well, it's Immutable collections is a separate NuGet package, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Or it
So
was.
is that basically what you're
Yes,
saying?
exactly.
It's
That's
not
exactly
going to
what
be
we're
in the
saying.
Redis. Is that?
Yeah, I think.
Well, even
NuGet-
Redis is kind of like a fuzzy thing, right? Because Immutable ships in the Redis, but it is still a separate NuGet package you can replace.
Same with async enumerable and 20 other packages. So that's
Yeah, like all I'm saying is, well, those are actually bad examples because they are type forwarded to Colib. Immutable is actually literally a separate
I
package.
see. So you're saying there's no forwarders. It's just a separate package. Whether it ships in the Redis is independent. You don't consider it BCL just because it's.
Well, that's I think what Kathleen is saying. To most people, Immutable for most people in the BCL means it is refed at the platform cadence and exclusively refed at the platform cadence, right? And I think that's usually because things live in Colib and we can't ship them independently. But with Immutable, we basically have the option to version it independently if we have to, but practically speaking, if you do file new project, it's already there. You don't have to do anything for that.
So we are gonna add it to the Redis.
So my goal long term would be to do that if we think it's useful, because if you do a file new console app, you probably want to parse the command arguments you get passed to yourself.
But
right?
just to clarify, you do want to rev this independently from private core.
For now. And,
Yeah.
and also, this is I think this is like a decision we revisit,
Okay.
and we revisit when we see what goes on as we move this forward. I think it's not a decision, I don't think we're ready to make decisions
Sure,
about
yeah.
that today. It's just the overall direction. I think it's helpful for you all in this conversation. Once I turn it over to John, I'm talking way more than I meant to, so I gotta be quiet here. And then today we do have a user study to show you, and I'm finally done. I apologize for taking a few extra minutes.
Did you want to go to that, or do you want to talk first about?
I want you to talk to them now.
Yeah.
I think we need devs talking to devs instead of PMs talking to devs for a few minutes, for the rest of the meeting.
Sorry, Emo, no one's talking to you.
Oh, you're done.
That's fine. I'm used to that
She's
now.
on vacation.
Okay.
I'm still on vacation.
I think I've said my piece, is what I'm saying, so I will tend to be quiet now.
I wanted to add a small bit of technical background to where this project came from internally. Some of the capabilities that are here were things that when we were rewriting the parser for the .NET CLI, which had a fairly long list of kind of intense requirements that were not meetable by any command line parsers that we were able to find that were part of the existing .NET open source ecosystem, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And some of those involved things like forwarding and transforming arguments with validation in between. As we forward arguments to MS build and to VS test, we want to validate them before passing them on. This was a big testability problem. One of the reasons why this was difficult is because there were no core syntax models that were sort of inspectable after parsing. And there were, another thing that was kind of a missing piece was the ability to actually tokenize. Most parsers don't have the ability to tokenize. They sort of trust that things will be pre-tokenized by the time main is invoked. So we said, well, if we want to be able to just do a pure parse of string input and have the tokenization be correct and then understand the syntax model, there were a bunch of other things we could then do with that. So it wasn't just about testability and transforming arguments, but it was also opening up the possibility to do things like explaining to someone the result of the parse output, like a grammar diagram, and to do things like completions in a way where the logic for the completion structure would be inside of your .NET code instead of in this separate shim script that would have to be written once for each different shell, right? And so this is a big place when Kathleen is talking about wanting to improve end user experience. This is a big place where most developers don't have the time or energy or expertise to go and build these scripts once for each different shell and make sure they work cross-platform, which is why tab completion tends to be only seen in a very small number of command line apps. So we said, how can we generalize some of these capabilities? So we took that parser work and started, and that's the thing, that was the pitch to Mark Michaelis a couple of years ago at the MVP Summit. These are capabilities we want to bring to an end user, but the API that we have right now isn't right. And so we want to try and build something from the ground up around some of these experiences. When we started using it then, we said, okay, no one actually wants a parser. They actually want the arguments to their app and they want an end user experience. So then we went from the parser in the first iteration, okay, actually the parser by itself is totally uninteresting. And then so we started looking at things like, support for rich model binding to object graphs, being able to express the inputs you want without having to directly configure the parser, which is the Dragonfruit experiment that Kathleen mentioned. Better I/O handling, rendering, things like this kind of grew out of that. So the earlier iterations of this project have been around exploring what are the complete set of bits that you need to make a good, complete command line app that has a good end user experience. And that's kind of the shape that the project has now taken on.
Which is part of why the API has gone from complex to simpler. It may not be all the way there yet.
Yeah, so I was about to say that one of the main things that I ran into with existing projects, parsers, is that the barrier to entry seemed to be very, very high.
Yeah.
What I wanted is, initially, I literally want something like one-liner, and I know that I will be expanding my app to have more and more capabilities, but I don't want to suddenly learn complicated syntax and grammar and define something, because I just want to see whether the first argument is A or B.
Have you seen,
And then evolve it over time.
Yeah.
Have you seen Dragonfruit? Do you know what that's the intention?
I don't know.
there is?
I tried few, but I don't remember now.
So Dragonfruit's an app model that we have where you give strongly typed arguments to main, and because you have downloaded the package, you have an extra thing in your build script that goes and wraps that in a main. So you've got, this is your world. This is what you write. You download the package, write this, and you're done. Okay, so that is what we mean when we say app model. We think that there's probably another case, but we haven't written it yet, but one way to do it is that instead of this, you have a complex object here that's quite complex, and then what you're doing is you are filling that object, and you're again wrapping, and this is coming there. Also, there's reasons you may not want to wrap, because then it's in your stack. So there's also, you can do the same thing without wrapping this way, so that you don't have the system command line in your stack. So it's written so all of those things work.
So this is a third-party library.
No,
Dragonfruit?
this is part of system command line.
Okay.
Dragonfruit is the app model we built to prove that we were app models from the beginning.
yeah.
It's a proof of concept. It's gotten a little bit of attention because if this is what you want to do, okay, this is dirt simple. And by the way, this type right here, This could be directory info. This could be, I think we're working on package, I don't know if it's done yet. So this can be rich, and then that would be supported by suggestions and tab completion.
The thing that's worth noting here in terms of describing an app model, another one that came up recently is someone asked for a convention where they could add an invoke method directly to their command object, inherit our command object, add invoke async to it. And we were able to make that work in just about 5 lines. It gives you parse diagramming, debuggers. There's a bunch of different aspects to it that you get for free. So this is really a way of shaping an API to a specific convention that you might decide this is the convention I want to use. But most of the logic of this thing is actually in the core System.CommandLine library. And so you could, similarly, you could write a model that was attribute driven, or you could write a DSL or things like this by manipulating the underlying API.
Or XML if you want to. All right, so we definitely want to answer questions. That was a great question, thank you. Also, we can go to the user study. That was what email asked us to bring. So we do have a user study recommendation that we can walk through if you like. So
I would be interested, I kind of still don't understand fully the relationship between what's built in here and what's, an extension. Like, how do you get started? I just create main and I can put a single argument that is not an array of strings, and then go.
Yep.
I see.
Once you install the System.CommandLine Dragonfruit, it adds targets to your project right
What
now.
does it mean?
It's a NuGet package.
It's a
Command line Dragonfruit.
Dragonfruit was just the code name.
Oh, okay.
We had a bunch of different app models, which would be different styles of APIs, and they all had different fruit code names.
And why do you have different app models?
We wanted to, in some senses, we wanted to make sure that the core abstractions were fungible across a bunch of different API styles, because people tend to be very opinionated about the APIs. Mm-hmm. And what we were trying to do is get to something where people could have their choice of different APIs. We wanted to build a platform that allowed people to then very easily give a good user experience to their end users without having to go into all of those details that we've talked about.
And Dragonfruit gets into your build. I mean, Dragonfruit puts something into your build. So this is pretty intrusive for some programmers. This is not something that you're going to put everywhere. We would never use this for the .NET CLI, for example. However, we would use another app model. We're likely to use another app model, which is likely to be something that's based on an inheritance model of the commands. That's just another vision that we've been playing with. So we have multiple ways that we think we can simplify the process of building your API, and we don't know which one of those are going to be popular to people, because that's where people start having their opinions, and people start caring, I want to be attribute based, but that hits a wall. Okay, so what are we going to do when we hit the wall in attribute based? And so we've separated those conversations. All of that opinionated conversation has been separated from the underlying core API.
But let's say we add one of those to the BCL, as we're saying, or to the redist. Mm-hmm. I assume we would choose one model and say, this is the standard .NET model that we recommend, but if you don't like it, you can grab an extension. And is that what we would do?
Maybe, or we may say that we don't know yet. It's one of the reasons we're not ready to put in the BCL yet.
Yeah, but
it could be also that we decide that what belongs in the BCL is actually the raw API. We're going to show you how you would work directly against the raw API. And it could be that the raw API is what belongs in closer in, and that the app models should be separate NuGet packages that can, there can be as many as the world wants to have against the raw API. And the raw API is intended to be usable. When I said we went from complicated to less complicated, that's all about that API surface. We've had Dragonfruit since nearly the beginning. So the fact that we did an app model, that's always been there. But we felt like underneath that, it had to be usable. And that's where we've been doing the evolution. That's where we plan to do the user study, because people are talking about this. People like this. If you're this simple, you like this, okay? Mm-hmm. Once you start having nested commands, we don't have the answer yet for that, because we haven't felt like we're ready to release those app models. And also, we wouldn't mind at all if the community did. We wouldn't mind at all if somebody else did those. And so that's part of why we focus now, after this, on that API surface.
So what is, could we walk and see some APIs starting from the bottom of the dependency start?
Yeah, I mean, like the one suggestion that I had to Kathleen and John was, because we want to do a user study, where they basically show us the code that they will, like basically the scenario that, because user studies are usually the getting started with an API, and then you see like what is the task, and then what is the API usage
Yeah.
that they expect.
I would
Which
suggest-
basically you see the APIs and you see assembly.
Yeah, let's look at the user study. If it doesn't answer your question, we'll go wherever you want to go. But let's see if this helps start answering that question. So what the user study is a series of steps with code that we think somebody might come up with. There's, of course, different ways that they could come up with it. But so you create a console application just to get you started. Let's first make sure that's also to find out, if they can't create a console application, we're going to have a different interpretation of what they're doing. Add the NuGet package. Here we're adding System.CommandLine, which is our core package. Dragonfruit's a different System.CommandLine. Dragonfruit, I think, is the way that gets brought in. Oh, we're not Microsoft Dot? Oh dear, I have to work on that. Okay, I didn't know that. We're supposed to all be Microsoft Dot now.
What? That's not.
NuGet packages?
No.
No?
No, system is reserved for Microsoft use.
Oh, you're right, System, I'm sorry. You're right, you're right. You're supposed to be Microsoft or System. My mistake. Okay, scroll down. Okay, so here's the first one. We're just getting an argument. Step 4. So, you want to walk through this, John?
Sure. So this is the invoke here. So starting from the top, there's a root command which you don't need to specify a name for. You can specify a name for it. It can be parsed either way. But one of the intentions of the root command is that it will understand in context the name of your application, your executable, or the alias by which it was invoked. And so in a complete command line submission, which can include a string, it's also able to parse that. It's able to understand it in context, with or without.
This is BusyBox's arg0 parsing.
So what did you just say?
BusyBox.
BusyBox is the Linux utility that literally does everything. If you invoke it as CD, it's CD. If you invoke it as RM, it's RM. It's
I see.
build everything into one utility so that you minimize the deployment on a floppy disk, because that's what it was designed.
And I misunderstood what you meant by BusyBox. I'm not sure whether BusyBox belongs here or not. This is arg0.
Right, but
Okay.
BusyBox
This
is
is
the
a
most
complicated
famous.
way to do arg0. That's the way I thought
I
you
will
would
ask
do it.
how you invoked me, and that changes what I do.
Yeah.
Our expectation is not that you would switch on that behavior, but you can because the tokens are there in the parse
Right.
result.
Yeah.
The argument here is a command argument. What you're seeing here is a collection initializer. I can switch between a couple of different syntax examples here. For the user study, we sort of said that the collection initializer might not be the most discoverable, but it's there because you're able to kind of see the structure.
Do you want to? Can you easily switch?
I
So
can-
what we
I can
have is
easily switch.
we have I went through the user study trying to be stupid, trying to be a user, and came up with a different set of syntax that I thought might be more discoverable. And so this is a different view to the same. These do exactly the same thing. We sort of think you might graduate to this closer to the other one. Obviously, anyone could just make those all dotted off. I think just command.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. So the thing the collection initializer allows you to nest commands, subcommands all the way down with arguments and options inside of them. Right, so you can, if you want to have that nested structure all in one declaration, it lets you do that. But they're just, the add method is really just calling add argument or add option or add command. So there are APIs for all of those things.
Okay, so you want to flip back? So people can see the other one?
So can I ask some questions on what this means? So I get the argument where you say new argument of string name. That makes sense, right? That is the thing that people pass to it, and their name is not the thing you say. It's just whatever we refer to it in the help, right? And,
Yes.
And the handler, I suppose, is the thing that gets invoked when everything was parsed, right?
When you call invoke, that is if it's whatever is the invoked command. If you have nested subcommands, then each command can have its own handler. So the handler of the command that was actually parsed as the innermost command will be the one that's invoked.
And then what are the generic arguments to create?
So that is what that's doing there is it's the types that you're expecting them to bind to. And that needs to match up with the argument type.
This and this. So string appears and say hello, and string appears as the type argument. And this is actually something we fought a lot with, and we'd be happy to show you where our pain points was. But I don't think that's something that's actually going to change in the runtime about how generics work. So we have a lot of pain around this point, the create handler, has right now 42 overloads because of different type parameter, different arities on type,
Yeah.
numbers of type parameters you might need to
Yeah.
pass, and
But that's actually-
pain, we're trying to isolate that pain which is inherent to
This is-
.NET generics.
Yeah, well, but this is also one of those places where a convention-based approach can be very straightforward. So Dragonfruit only uses an overload of create handler that passes in the delegate for your main entry point.
Then you just use it by name of the parameter.
You get a method info in whichever way you want.
Yeah.
So,
So basically, so that means that basically answers my second question. So like, I assume the parameters of that method you're invoking have to match the order in which you added the arguments.
They're by name. The idea to do it by name. So it's a name transform. Because obviously your option name might have delimiters and hyphens in it and things like this that are common in POSIX convention, or slashes that are common in the Windows convention. We know how to parse both. So it's a name-based matching, which is inspired by ASP.NET, which has been a convention there, name-based matching on model binding for many years. But it still turns out to be a fairly, once people understand that it works that way, they're fine. But it's not discoverable, as a lot of conventions are not. So this is one of the things that Kathleen's.
So are you saying like you will match by name, or are you matching by ordinal?
We're matching by name. I think matching by ordinal only makes sense if the code is small enough that you can see it all at the same time. So we've had people say, hey, this would be a nice thing to do. You could certainly support a convention like that pretty easily based on the core APIs, but right now we're matching by name.
So but when you match by name, why do you care about the types? Why can't they just say command handler dot create and pass basically any delegate? Why do you need me to specify the types?
One of the problems with delegates generally is that many developers are tempted to, or the compiler can create automatically a wrapper around the actual method you intend on calling. And that means things like parameter names, attributes on the parameters, attributes on the method you intend to call could get lost during that process. That's actually why I'm pessimistic about things like this that take a delegate rather than a straight up method info. Like if you look at ASP.NET's model binding, they don't use delegates, they use method infos because they need to perform reflection over the actual metadata of the method info.
Yeah.
I think it's also worth calling out here, and it's something that I've hit every time I've used System.CommandLine, is the argument is optional. Meaning if you invoke just hello, it will invoke, you won't get any error handling with this code here, and it will just say hello, exclamation point.
Right, because you can declare it as required, but we did not declare it as required here.
Yeah.
So by default, arguments are not required. That would be a point that we haven't gotten feedback on that yet. We made a decision so that we could move forward and we could see whether by default it should. I don't know what the basis.
Some of these things have actually changed. So because one of the changes that we made that I think influenced both of these things, there is support for a required option, which a lot of people had asked for. An argument, you can have multiple arguments of different types, right? So if you think of a move command where it takes multiple arguments, you might have a file info and a directory info. So move argument 1 to argument 2. And the arities of those arguments can be defined. So you could say, I've got an arity that allows 5 different arguments for one type, file infos, and a final arity that allows where the arity is exactly 1, and that's the directory. Right. So this influences whether things are required or not. But it's a little bit of a complex API in that sense.
Well, and that's also for options, not arguments.
That's for arguments.
Not the options that are passed arguments.
So that API has also changed, which is that we have option of T, and you don't need to go directly. Syntactically, an option has a child argument, but we've kind of flattened that out in the Surface API. Not in the core parser. The underlying parser has to understand these as syntactically distinct from one another. But the API has simplified so you don't need to think about the option, the argument that is attached to an option. Let me show a diagram of that.
And the next one's going to be an option as well. So 2 down, step number 6, I think, is a option with an argument. So this user study does an argument first because that's going to be the hard part, getting invoke right, and then an option with a argument.
So given this diagram to explain some of the terminology here, this argument here is you don't need to access it. You can just invoke. You can just create an option of directory info. So you don't need to use this part of the API here. That's a recent change that we're kind of working through because it added a little bit of complexity. So typically, these things that you nest in there, you can be root command, a command, and then either arguments or options. You don't really need to
So let me get the terminology right. So basically, a command is everything that is prefixed with effectively a keyword like .NET, add, or package, right? And then an argument is basically just a value that you pass to it. And then an option is something that is dash or dash dash name,
or slash.
which then may or may not take an argument, depending on whether it's a bool or not.
Correct. Yep. And the thing that subcommands. Sometimes people call these subcommands. They're also called verbs in a lot of command line
Yeah.
apps.
Do you really call these types argument of T and option of T?
Yes.
So I don't know if we want to start like more detailed review, but how deeply I would be concerned with this. To me seems, so I'm kind of trying to understand long-term picture, like where we end up with this.
Yeah.
Right.
And I can tell you my opinion. I don't know if it's shared by the whole team. I think that we should have something super simple built into the platform. Yeah. And then have underlying low-level APIs that offer flexibility for people who maybe the simple thing doesn't work for them, maybe they have a different preference about syntax and whatnot. So to me, these things will be in the low-level bucket, and therefore I would not use really good names like argument of T and option of T for low-level types.
Yeah. The other problem that we have with argument and option is that they're not very specific to your domain. Like option of T, for example, like has been used by other people to just basically have a better version of a nullable value type, right?
Sure.
So I would say that come up with some prefix at least, so you can differentiate them from other arguments and other options. But then also, in terms of concepts, I mean, I think the names are fine conceptual wise, because I think they correlate to what people know from command lines, right? They know what an argument is, they know what an option is usually.
And the terminology is taken directly from POSIX.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yeah, but a prefix, like Imo was saying, would solve the problem. And we could either say command, argument, command option, or bless the CLI acronym.
Prefix,
Yeah.
Sometimes.
In talking to people, I'm surprised how many people do not relate to the syntax of their commands as a CLI. So this has been used by a number of people in this building, saving them having to understand or write a different parser. And as I've worked with them on their syntax and on their help, that is very jarring for them to think about that as CLI. So we can work on the right prefix. I'm all for that. I have no problem with that. But it's been really shocking to me how many people think the CLI is something different than what they're doing. And I suspect if that's going on with devs in this building, it's likely to be more so outside.
Yeah, to me CLI is common language infrastructure.
All right, so why don't we go through what we've got here and then we can talk some more. Once you get argument, and the reason I did this user study this way is that I talked to Imo about some things about the user study before he left for vacation, and it's gone completely unavailable to me while I actually did this work. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Just kidding. I think that there is this big, the challenge is going to be whether they can get an argument passed and get invoked in. That's the place we're most concerned about right now. We'll be looking a little bit more on that. I want to come back to what you said, Christoph, a little bit later. And then adding an option, we hope is easy. Once you get the rest of it, we hope this part is kind of easy.
How do you specify some relationships? Like if this argument is passed, you need this option, otherwise the option doesn't make sense, and more complicated. Like how does it work?
So the way that that's working right now, there are two different APIs actually for this, because we started out in a place that was maybe not as simple, so we have another one, and we're kind of trying to figure out which one is the better one. But I'll show you the newer version of it, which is around, let's see, where is this thing? Custom parsing.
And this, by the way, was in direct response to Ryan Novak running into a problem with something he was doing with it, and he felt something was too difficult. And both the specific thing he was going after may wind up being something we directly support and just say, here you go, because it was finding a project file. It's very common for us. But what he needed to do that, we realized that maybe we should do a new API for. So that's what, well, it's not what we're going to show here. We're going to show something different. Sorry.
So, well, this is an I don't have that exact example, but I can show you what that would look like. So you're able to specify how the argument will be parsed, meaning that any tokens associated with a parent symbol, whether that's a command or an option, you get this symbol result, or argument result in this case, which has the token collection on it. But you can also look up the chain on it and see what its parent and associated. You can see the parse hierarchy at that point. So you can write a validation that takes into account other things that were parsed on the command line.
So result has a parent, correct?
Yes.
So you could say result of parent not equal to blah, and then you could say that this fails. So you can fail your parse, and so you could say this fails, and you could give a message there if it's not attached to the correct parent up the tree, wherever it would be. I will say that working with people on the syntax of their command lines, once I write that up, which is high on my agenda of things to do, I will say do that as rarely as possible, because your help becomes nonsense once you do that. There's no real way to express it. So as much as possible, try and have it be at the command level, that you split things up into groups. And like the first ML.NET syntax, I still think it could be better, but the first one was incomprehensible, and now it's at least usable. So yeah.
But so that touches on something that worries me, unless I am misunderstood. So the moment I want more complicated rules about options and arguments, I kind of have to do parse myself. The only thing that I'm seeing the system gives me is the tokens, and I'm now on my own. I have
This is not quite the case.
Okay.
Let's take a look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In this example, the tokens that you will receive are only the ones that were syntax. It is really building a syntax tree.
Yeah.
So the tokens that you're going to receive, even if you're buried way down inside of a bunch of other subcommands and there's other options and everything else, you're going to be receiving the tokens that only were applied to that specific object. Right? So you're only at that point you don't have to understand whether someone did -x1 -x2 -x3 or -x123, which are POSIX equivalent command line inputs. You're going to see in those tokens
Okay,
1,
okay.
2, 3.
I see.
It's a lot like Roslyn in that you don't actually have to go and parse the lexical stuff yourself. You get an actual tree that you can move down, but if you really wanted to get into things, you can get trivia information and stuff like that.
So I would tell me if it's fair characterization. You normalize it, but then I still, if I want to enforce some rules, I have to kind of write the rules myself.
If your
Or the
rules,
normalized representation.
we're working on getting the right set of rules that you can hit more easily. So for example, everything around strongly typed and arity is handled for you. We're working on types, getting the right set of types in place for you and named correctly. So there's an array of things we think should be handled, like, for everybody all the time. We also recognize that no matter what we think of, you're going to have some off-the-wall thing that nobody else wants, that's just for you, and we need a way to do that. And while this is called parse, it may not be the perfect name, because all you're doing is taking 1, 2, 3 and deciding what you want to do to it. So for example, you might say, hey, tell me if this wouldn't work. Hey, that should actually be 1, 2, 3 smashed together, forget spaces, okay? So this is something very weird that you want to do, nobody else wants to. Maybe you want to comment a limit. 1, 2, 3, okay? So this is you taking that, transforming it the way you want it to be transformed, and then moving on. And so I think it's important to understand that A, it's a limited case, and B, parse is almost not the right name for it. It's almost more of a transform that you're doing to the result, and maybe that name is wrong.
I guess a better example would be for files. You would like to say, does the file already exist, or is it actually a valid file name?
But we already
So
have that.
we have those baked in.
Yeah, but those are the kind of things you would build, right? And you would say, if it's a relative path, I want it to be relative to, let's say, some other extrinsic directory that is not common.
Yeah,
the
that's a
current
great
one,
example.
right?
There's some off-the-wall thing you're
But
doing there.
correct me if I'm wrong, but like the validators are always in the context of a very particular argument, right? So I think Crystal's original question was, what if you have mutual dependency between saying, well, if you do this operation, then you need to specify this, this, or that. If you do this other thing, you have to specify one of these two. Like at that point, you talk about something that is on top of all the arguments you have. And I guess that's just a complete custom rule that I
there's
write
two-
after invoke, basically.
There's a couple of different approaches you can take to that, but yes, so the symbol result that's passed, if you say parse argument, the symbol result that's passed in there, it has the syntax tree available. But there's also a middleware pipeline on invocation, so you can, if you want to see the parse result as a whole object and say, okay, I know what command was invoked, I know what options are on there, and that kind of thing, you can do that as well.
And just add one thing to that. You can do it that way. It's the only way today. This is a problem that I'm continuing to think on for an entirely different reason. So first of all, I don't want to make this so simple you do it, because it's extremely difficult for end users when you do this. This is hard for end users, period. So I hesitate to make it easy. However, today, your ability to express that in help is zero. There's just no way to do it. If I could come up with a way to have those kind of interdependencies clear in help, then I would drive it through. So that's the way you would define it, but not so much because I want to make that easy, because it's really not something that, I mean, I want to allow people to do everything, but I don't really want to encourage people to do things that are painful for end users.
So I totally, what I was saying before, I believe we should end up with something very prescriptive and simple in the BCL built in. At some point we ship a package. This is how you do command line. It has restrictions. Maybe it has syntax that, frankly, is a bit less convenient for the benefit that you were saying, for the benefit of the end user who then uses the app. I really like the philosophy, by the way, of focusing on what's the end user experience of the user using the app, not not optimized just for the developer who writes this, So I really like it, and I think the best way to do it is to not let developers do whatever they want to do, right?
Some opinions I think would help.
Yeah, exactly. But then, this seems to be also, there needs to be low-level API, and this needs to be very flexible, I guess.
Yeah.
If you target it at people who have various weird, requirements and.
I mean, it's kind of race-connected too, right? They have low-level building blocks, and then they have high-level kind of extension methods, fluid APIs, kind of things to wire stuff together without writing, 100 lines of code. But it also means you can wire these things pretty much in any combination you want, which is quite powerful.
I think there's actually one distinction that this brings up, and it's one of the places. So we have the option of T, argument of T, but there's also a non-generic option of argument. And the reason is that those are intended to be configured by convention. So if you have a method info and you say, I want to use this method info here, right? So I'm going to write my own code that reflects over the parameters to this method info and builds the parser based on them, which is exactly what the Dragonfruit model is doing. You can handle these things in a non-generic context and say, okay, the type for this argument will be type of this, right? The type for this option will be type of this, and you can directly control the arities and things. So we're deriving arity based on the expected bound type, option of T. If you say option of string array, the arity is going to be 0 to any number. If you say option of string or option of int, the arity is going to be exactly 1. But those lower level APIs exist, so you can go and build those kinds of maybe more opinionated API on top of it.
Yeah.
And we haven't taken a strong opinion on what that final API should be. We've tried to make it as usable as possible.
Still, if I understand how the Dragonfruit works, I like it. That's how I would want to start. I have one, or I have two options initially, Boolean and a number. I just add Boolean and int parameters, and I'm done. And then I can, as long as I don't know how it scales. Like, what happens after a while? Does it get super, super messy?
The only problem I ended up encountering with Dragonfruit, because I talked to John like over a year ago about command line, and I started using that for ClangSharp when I was doing some work on that. And Dragonfruit ended up working really well, but the problem I hit with it was argument validation logic. But there's been some improvements since then, including in the low-level API, which is what ClangSharp's currently using. And I think that it could end up in that right area.
And what were the problems of validation?
When I initially tried it out, because ClangSharp ended up passing a lot of args down to Clang itself, there was just some differences with how Dragonfruit worked versus how Clang expected arguments to be passed through, was the primary issue.
Like, Dragonfruit was too aggressive?
It didn't provide enough customization with how things ended up being handled.
Yeah, the lower level APIs let you do things like define custom validators, custom parsing to the types that you want to output. You can define whether or not equals or colon or space are valid delimiters between an option token and an argument token, or more than one token. You can define whether unparsed tokens are an error or not. So if we have support for double dash unparsed tokens, you get that in the parse result. So .NET CLI uses this dash dash. If you do .NET run dash dash, everything else is passed along. It's not parsed. It's validated later in the parser chain. So we support that POSIX convention natively. There's also the concept of unmatched tokens, where we'll collect up all the tokens that didn't have a match in your grammar. And you can decide on a subcommand by subcommand basis whether that's an error or not. Because sometimes you just want to take them in and say, okay, you know what, let me handle them. Take total control over it. And sometimes you want to say, yeah, there's an unrecognized token there, that's an error. And this, in practice, in the .NET CLI, the rules for that were different for different verbs, for different subcommands. So those capabilities are there. But Dragonfruit, right now, because it's so convention-based and so opinionated, we didn't go and design ways to access all of that complexity. But this right here is the Dragonfruit setup. So you can see, we're configuring the root command based on a method info. We're configuring the help based on .comments, and then use defaults. And what you're seeing here is a whole bunch of stuff that's just built in, right? So you can configure this stuff directly yourself, but we're saying, okay, you automatically get help, you automatically get a version option, a parse directive, which is a way of understanding your grammar. So this is a parse directive, which we can talk about what that means a little bit more as well.
Although we only have 3 minutes, so we're also going to figure out next steps.
Well, we have 1 hour and 2 minutes, but yeah.
Oh, we have an hour
Yeah,
and
we
3
got the
minutes.
full 2 hours.
That's why I don't do 1 hour
Yeah.
design reviews, because we usually
Excellent.
only scratch the surface.
It's hard to make that bigger, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Especially on one that's going to be really cool.
Because it's the Windows terminal.
Oh, it's the Windows terminal. Yay, Windows terminal. Okay, so
Right, so that's what the parse directive is. Again, this is the kind of it's there as an end user thing as well, so that a lot of command lines have a dry run option. This is kind of an equivalent, but it's just built in at the parser level, so you can understand how is the parser going to understand this input before you actually run it.
and the exclamation point is,
Invalid.
and so Jupyter is invalid. Is that what you're saying?
It means that command has some unsatisfied.
Okay, and the star is.
The star means that an implicit or default value was used.
Okay, so we
I
did
missed my
have
connection
to
file.
jump kind of off of standards in a few places, and one of the things is that there's a clear need to give things to the parser layer in addition to what's going through to the actual CLI itself. And we use the square brackets for that. That's something we would be very willing to change if other people in the community doing other parsers said, no, we should be doing something else. But we're using square brackets. It has to be distinct from dash dash, and it has to be distinct from arguments. It has to be clearly going to the parser layer. There's an implication here that you should maybe mention that we have a pipeline here. I don't think you said that.
I mentioned it offhandedly, but we didn't talk about it.
You mentioned middleware.
Yeah, I mentioned
Middleware. Yeah,
middleware.
okay, I didn't know me mentioning it. That's it.
That's what these things are doing. To look at a really simple example is version option. Right. So when we say use version option, we're creating an option which is for version. We add the option to the command line builder. You don't need to use a command line builder. You can use the syntax that we showed before, but these things might need to be sorted out. There's a little bit of a transition there between what we originally had as an immutable API, and we made the API mutable to better facilitate building custom API surfaces on top of the core.
Why do you have immutable API?
That was something that we started out with just for safety, but it turned out to be harder to use.
It didn't.
So-
We
So it's not-
it is no
I'm
longer
not a
an
big
immutable
fan of
API.
immutable APIs
It's not in
because
that
they
space at all anymore.
It is no longer.
Mm.
It took a while to make changes on that.
I'm also not a big fan of fluent APIs.
Yeah, I was thinking that, but with a builder pattern, especially
Yeah.
with ASP.NET, like people are used to it nowadays.
Yeah, and I tried using this before the Fluent was fully there, and I hit a lot of places where I was like, instead of being able to just say like new argument dot blah 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 blah, I actually have to declare an explicit variable named arg, and then initialize it, then call helper methods, and then finally pass it to add argument, and that was just a pain.
But having said that, like if we end up with high-level API and low-level API,
Yep.
I think it's actually good to focus in the low-level API on flexibility and kind of simplicity of the model, not on usability and tricks and like the fashions of 2020. No, what's
yeah 2020.
Yeah.
Are you still on vacation?
This is just to sort of show how the middleware works and how you can bring in additional functionality. And so a lot of it is just built in this way. The ultimate invocation of your handler is able to be modified based on a bunch of cross-cutting stuff.
And
So it's-
all of the, well, not all, I think most of the pieces we talked about as being features, they're actually implemented in middleware. And as help is a great example of that. So we have a help default. So by default, you write CLI, you have help. So
And RSP files.
what?
RSP files.
RSP files, write response files is another thing that is just automatic. But if you don't want that or you want your own way to do that, you can certainly put that in. We have some other ways we would like to be able to have help be customized. That's a very important area. It's run into a few problems around the console abstractions. And so we're still working some details out on that. And it's one of the things that we need to work at least across the company in that with PowerShell, and Windows Terminal Hills is in that working group. I know they are in us. There's about 4 or 5 groups in a working group on getting our experience on the terminal. And one of the things is we're like, as members of .NET, we're like, we do not want to be where Rich is standing up on stage and talking about how great the Windows Terminal is and some great feature it has that's dependent on better VT100 support than System Console has, and .NET is completely flat-footed, can't be on the stage, and we're starting at stage 0. We are about 2 weeks out from being able to be on stage with anything Rich shows. So we're staying right behind him. That is not, it's not funded, and that's like a lot of work, and we're probably going to have to fund that part before it can actually go into like really blossoming. However, it is in the field in System Diagnostics. System Diagnostics relies on that. So we already have that dependency. They couldn't do it without it. I don't remember what they needed, but they were unable to use System.console to get the work they wanted out the door.
Yeah.
So
they're using the System Command Line rendering component to do data layouts.
You kind of hinted at this earlier. Do you intend on this augmenting or fully replacing System.console in the long run?
it's a complex
That's
question.
that is.
He gets it.
So it would not be a replacement, because I think that the abstractions are not in the right place in System.console for it to be replaceable without a big breaking change. It's such a fundamental one that I don't see the way forward to that.
Well, right. I guess when I say replacement, I mean, would we tell people don't use System.console any longer, use this instead?
Well,
for
I
other
think
applications?
that will be a very hard sell, because literally this is console.writeline is in virtually every single like Hello World thing.
Yeah.
But I think the one thing we should tell people is that unless all you do is read line and write line, like as soon as you talk about colors, positioning, basically you use it as a terminal with like window width and window height and all the other stuff that console has.
Yeah.
Console does not work very well. Like it starts with the fact that some of the APIs we can't even implement, right? If you ask for window width on anything but Windows, it blows up because we don't know how to retrieve it. And I think in general the way colors work on Windows, or it used to work before they had first class VT support, is not great cross-platform either. So I think for everything that is not just basically the stream-based reading and writing, I think we should steer people away from
So we
console.
expose a new type, System.terminal, and we deprecate System Console.
To be honest, like that would not be entirely horrible, but
So-
I think we can never really move console.writeline from people like that.
No,
would
but
be-
we could maybe implement on top of this.
I think so.
We
Yeah.
So
could.
there's specific. You mentioned System.terminals. Specifically, there's one of the things that we've done here, and this is one of the connection points between the rendering work and the sort of application framework side of it, which includes the parser. Are a couple of abstractions that we added. Initially, we understood them as improving testability, which is iConsole, and iConsole eventually split out from iTerminal. So any notion of statefulness is gone from these things, and iTerminal is still very much a sketch of where we think we might go, and that's one of the things we're working on Rich Turner's team with, and working with the PowerShell team on, is figuring out what that abstraction ideally should look like. iConsole is a strict standard in, standard out, standard error, and nothing more. They're just streams, and in fact, those streams themselves may be, text writer and text reader are not the right abstractions there either, because the notion of passing an object through to it presupposes some kind of formatting, and you can't really talk about formatting without talking about whether you're in an ANSI terminal or not, or whether you're redirecting output. So we've very much simplified what iConsole means.
But you can talk about, I mean, colors are universal, correct?
Not necessarily. So the system console colors, for example, is 16 colors, and there's a name for it.
Yeah.
But VT100 supports a very, very wide array. I don't know how many. It's
but
RGB colors. So.
For a purpose of some common abstraction, you could imagine some, common abstraction for color support. And if the only thing that we expose is text writer, then
There's other things in there as well in VT100. Cursor positioning, capturing screen state, restoring screen state. There's a lot of things that are designed to interact with a remote terminal where you have no notion of what its state is.
So to give you an idea of what the problems are, so like VT, because it's stateful, like you can position your cursor, but a very common thing on Unix is you have a pager, right? Basically, when you say git log, it automatically pipes to a pager that basically stops, and then you have cursor support to scroll up, scroll down. The thing that writes to the console doesn't know it's being paged. So, but you still want to have colors, right? And so the way, because the colors are inline, the pager can actually retain them and like repaint them when you scroll up, scroll down, right? Which on Windows doesn't work this way. So when you're on Windows, for example, and you redirect it, and you try to like emit colors, like bad things will happen, right? So like these things don't necessarily compose in the way you want if you want to completely abstract it away. Like at some point you just have to make a decision whether you are assuming VT100 support or you don't, but you can't really completely hide the fact that you require it at some point. But I think it's very clear that for cross-platform, I think that's the way we need to do it anyways. If you want your app to look great on Mac and Linux, then...
And this is the strong recommendation from the Windows console team going forward, is that people should be using ANSI escape characters, escape codes.
And as we get to the iConsole and iTerminal, I think that is something that this group will be intensely involved in, as well as these other groups. We expect that the shape of that is important. There's a lot of people that will have input to that, including everyone on this team, to get that right. That may lie in a different location. My guess is, in the end, that will wind up in a different location than System.CommandLine. That is a very fundamental piece. It should be written in a way that's very fundamental across a great many usages, and would eventually then probably one way or another relate somewhat to System.console.
And start with our guidance that says you should prefer an abstract class to an interface in every case.
Yes.
So there's no iConsole. There's
Okay,
console.
but like...
And that's fine too, but that abstraction needs to exist somewhere for us to decouple at some point from System.console.
Call it terminal, right? Like
Sure, I'm just like...
Okay,
keep
no,
talking about
that's
the
interesting.
interface,
I'm
but we
thinking
actually
through that
suggest
because,
not to use interfaces.
So one thing, can we look at some concrete examples? Because I mean, like you already started with like hello world kind of scenarios for the command line parser. So the things I would like to see, like just go through your scenarios a little bit further, because I have some questions on how what I consider basic stuff, like how that would look like.
Okay. So we may or may not. You mean you want to go through the rest of the user study?
Yeah, because I think it's easier if we look at concrete examples of what we expect.
I didn't take this very far because I was imagining a single user study, and I'm actually imagining that it will take somebody quite a while to do that step that says figure out the invoke and all of that. Our experience in working with people in the community is that we is a challenge. We don't know yet how to solve that challenge, but that part is a challenge. And again, we do hope to have app models where, like you said, it's not the normal case, but it is the case we're checking right now.
And the study, has it been already conducted, or it's...
What Emo did was ask us to propose a study.
Yeah.
You guys can give us feedback on how we should do the study, and then we'll do the study. And I have a list of things that when I went through it, I have concerns. I've got like 15 concerns about people may run into a problem here. Some of them may be fixable. Some of them we're still really struggling. We've really already thought a lot about invoke and the handler and how to make that easier. So far, we haven't had an insight that's really moved the needle a long way on that. We would love to continue. So the information about ASP.NET only uses method info because of all the problems that we're running into. Yeah. That was great for us to hear.
So lots of this work is happening in open source environment, and now we are recording, and you're gonna post it to YouTube.
Yep.
How are we gonna ensure that the usability subjects have not been tainted?
In the past, we just literally ask them.
Okay.
And we try to like get people that haven't used the API. But I mean, like I would say, like my number one concern with your example is I think the amount of code you have on screen is doable. My biggest concern is if I use your library for the very first time, I will probably see on the order of like 50 to 100 types. Are those the types that I'm most likely to try to use? Because I mean, root command is not the thing I would think of when I'm saying I want to parse my command line arguments, right? And that's the number one thing when we used the JSON usability study was getting people to the point where they can deserialize and serialize. Took massive efforts because guess what? We didn't call our method serialize and deserialize. We gave them other names that we thought good, but turns out nobody could do the mapping in their head. And that's, I think, the one thing you probably want to focus on of like, you know, the 5 lines of code we expect the Hello World developer to write. Do these names and concepts make sense? I think argument and option are perfect. It's more the fact that they don't have a prefix, but I think they're mapped to what people would like to do. The handler maybe, because you could argue that it's an event handler kind of thing, but like the root command, I don't think people would figure it out.
Yeah, we've gone through. There's 2 things that are extra tools. We want to simplify wherever we can. I think that invoke. I just put in a PR for the invoke user help to include the word handler, so that there is a hint right there. There's some things like that we can do to help a little bit. I agree with you. And we've struggled a little bit about that very first point that you get in. And my version, if you switch over to, so John looked at my version, he says, I want to show them kind of the right way to do it, instead of showing them what I did, which was what I think you'll fall into. Actually, my first version,
yes.
And hello, this really shouldn't be there for root command. There's no reason for it. Mine, I just went straight to command, because, and since I don't know what's going to happen if you start editing this too much.
That's what's going to happen.
I think command's easier to find than root command, and it actually works if you say command. The only thing is you have to give a name for a command instead of a root command. There's no reason you have to use root command over command. It's just a simplification. So, but finding command that's one of my concerns. So I absolutely agree.
Yep.
And we are going to and so this is messier because I think people are more likely to find command.add argument than to think of using a collection initializer.
Especially that the collection, I was about to comment on it when you were showing previous example. The collection must be of types that are not argument option but rather of a base type of these.
Which is the case.
Which we've seen it many times in usability study. People would see, there's some collection of, I command
It's called
thing, correct? And they're like, okay, what can I pass here? What are all the things? And now the namespace has 50 types. They're like, okay, I bet I can pass argument, but I'm not sure. And how do I pass an option, especially if the name is not intuitive?
I mean, this is the problem of any polymorphic thing, because one thing that VS generally sucks at is you can't explore derived types easily. You can see base types easily, you can't explore derived types easily. So when they know what the base type is you expect, I mean, unless the type names have very consistent naming and they're in the same namespace, people have no way to finding them. And like we have seen this in anything that is a DOM API where you have like an abstract base element, people don't find stuff, right? Like that's one thing. The other thing I would say with the collection initializers is we did the same thing in JSON. People like when they're there because people like to write declarative code.
Yeah.
But most of the time, like what you want to make sure is that the normal Roslyn fixer suggestions to say, oh, you can use an initializer here, probably don't work in your case because you have.
They do.
Do that work when you say .add argument? Because I think they only work when the things. Yeah.
If you say add argument, they don't work.
Yeah. So like that's the other thing. Like make sure that those pop, because then people discover that from there. But I think it's fair to say the way people usually work is they find a root type.
Yep.
And then they basically just dot off of that thing and see what happens, right? And so if you don't have methods or things on there that make sense to them, the amount of people that just get lost is very, very high.
That's why this code happened. Is I was going through exactly that process. I'm trying as best I can to think like somebody who hasn't seen this before. And so add argument, I really like being able to find add argument, add alias, add option, all of those were awesome. There was a couple of things I had to come back and do. This was a little bit non-intuitive. There's a few things but the one that we're most concerned about, which is the one we're going to see in the user study, is the handler and invoke relationship. And we just haven't yet figured out a way to simplify that out yet.
Is there any reason why you couldn't just provide data to invoke? Because probably I would probably never mess with the handler. I would probably do everything up to including add option. I would just say invoke, and then nothing would happen, right? I would just be very confused.
It's an interesting idea. I would think that in that case, just to keep it, because these gets absolutely insane, some of these overloads, looking at method info for that might be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, so method info is supported, so that could potentially work if the type inference will work out in a way that's sensible.
So is there no way for me to basically get a strongly typed representation of the inputs without
There is.
a model binder effectively that maps it to parameters? There's no such thing as
So invoke is just there's invoke and invoke async, and they're just convenience methods actually. What they do internally is exactly what you're describing. There's the intermediate step that we said most people don't care about the parser itself. Most people don't care about the parse result itself. They want to go from input to bound, strongly typed objects as quickly as possible. That was the idea that Dragonfruit was trying to see. How much can we simplify that? But what all of those those steps along the way are all present there. So if we look at invoke, if we look at something like this, what we're doing here, so this invocation pipeline it's composing up the middleware. When you call invoke directly, we're assuming you want the middleware that provides things like the version option, help, and all these other stuff, right? The things that you saw for Dragonfruit. So invoke is kind of the default, run my application with all of the bells and whistles. But what it really decomposes down to, a lot of these are, actually that was not the extension method I was looking for.
While you're looking for that, let me also say that.
It's this here.
Oh, you found it too soon. I was
Right.
going to say something else.
And there's different overloads here that will do a split on on string input, for example, or parse the args. And what they're doing is passing a parser. They're building a parser, building up the middleware, parsing it, getting back a parse result. So you can do the same thing once you have that command object. There's extension methods to go, command.parse or option.parse or argument.parse. What they're doing is they're building up the parser and handing you back a parse result, which is effectively describes.
How do I interrogate the data from the parse result? Then do I use strings where I say basically give me the value for my option foo, or how do I get the data out?
You call parse result find result for, and that will traverse and you can pass in the object itself. So if you've stored references to all of your different symbol objects.
Can you go back to the sample code? So can I? Can I basically pass in the mark option and then the count option, and then it gives me back the actual value?
Yeah, what that would look like would be this.
And it would be strongly typed because you know the T, right?
Exactly.
Do you want to go into edit
Yeah.
visual?
Okay, that's not bad.
Yeah. So I'll show a quick example of that. So what this is doing, if we go and look for an example of this, right? It looks like this. Right. This one is looking at the tokens, but then you can also do
Right. Get value
or default. And there are both, again, there's this kind of set of generic and non-generic APIs. Since we know what the type is, but you may not know it at compile time, there's a get value or default will return the correctly bound value, but it's coming back as an object, and you need to.
So what does default in this context mean? The default that I configured at some point, or is it literally just the normal CLR definition of default meaning 0 or null?
It could be either one, right? So you don't know, when you're using this API, you don't necessarily know whether someone configured the parser to have a default value. So maybe you have an option of type int, right? And they said the default value is 123. When you call get value or default,
I get 123.
you're going to get 123.
But
if they
okay,
didn't configure a default value, you're going to get the default for the type.
Right. That makes sense. And
the other thing that's interesting to note about this API, you can reuse option, argument, and command objects at different points in your hierarchy, right? So you might have an option that you want to apply to several different verbs. I have a verbose option that applies to several different verbs, and they're leaf nodes in your command hierarchy. This will go and find, again, this is a syntactic thing. This will go and find the value for that, regardless of where it's applied. So find result for doesn't require you to understand the command line.
I think I know what you said. I'm not entirely sure. You're basically saying that because you can have multiple commands, logically you have different instances of -- verbose, and they might be distinctively different because they might have different defaults. They might have different.
They can be.
Yeah.
They can either
But-
be different or the same, and one of the scenarios for that was something that I think we ran into in char.net, although it may have been changed, where the way that you wanted to semantically consider the tree was different than the way the user might actually want to express it on the command line. So there was an option that logically needed to be allowed in two different places, and the user needed to not have to worry about constructing it correctly. And so in that case, the same option appeared on two commands, on a parent command and on a child command,
Sure.
so that when they were typing, when a user was typing, they could put it in either place, and it was all good. Everything was fine.
Right.
And so there's some things like that were built in. That was actually one of the drivers for a change. At one point, you couldn't reuse options, and
Sure.
now you can, and we think that was a really good change.
Right. So to give a more concrete example of that, and I'll show the parse result as well if you want to look at this.
Which also gives you an idea of how nice the collection initializers can be here, because also as long as you make your handlers very short, like you're just giving the method name, then it doesn't distract from your view of medium-sized CLIs. So the size of the .NET CLI is not going to look good like this, and if you're just doing something as simple as something would work in Dragonfruit, it only helps you a little bit. But on this kind of middle level CLI complexity, it's really nice to see it this way. And we think that's where a lot of authors are going to land. The authors that need this are going to land. If you just take two values, you're going to survive. If you just use args and you don't use anything, you won't have help though, because it's actually you don't get there really simply, 10 lines of code to get help output. And so so that would be the reason you would use it if you just had like one or two arguments.
It's just I wonder whether people know when they start writing an app, where they're gonna end up.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So this works all the time, and so like right now, it's like, it's not that complicated, but you can imagine that. But by the way, on that, the big when I write up my CLI document, the biggest thing is fantasize doing that and write up as much of your CLI as you can for the next 5 years when you start, because then you have a coherency over time, as if just adding things as you think of them, in which case you won't be coherent. And I could give you examples. So anyway, this is actually
So what does it now mean if I specify -x123 and if I say -x, so right after the open quote, if you say -x5 and then you say space subcommand -x123, because that's also legal, correct?
It's not legal in this case because I haven't said that the option, so the default option arity for int, since the default model binding convention doesn't know how to take two different values for this, right, and conflate them, right? So you have two tokens here. If you were to do a custom parser, if I passed in the argument that is with the parse delegate, what I would see is that the result for the X option has two tokens on it.
you could do either, but not both. Here you're doing both. It's illegal because you did both.
Now,
But like according to your definition of the command, x can occur in two places.
yes, but it's not valid to define it in both places in the same input.
Because
The
it's-
arity is
because it's
2.
referencing
Here
two.
your arity is 2, not 1. If you gave it an arity of 2, this would be legal.
If you said new option int x in both places, then it would be two different.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is the reference equality versus syntactic equality.
Interesting. So you basically rely on the fact that it's literally the same instance of that option.
Yeah,
And that's the way this one was defined.
So this means that X can occur in either of these places, but it has to be only one of them.
Precisely.
Yes, because it has an arity of 1.
If we wanted to be able to specify it more than once, we might set, by convention, we could say, oh, this is an int array, right?
Right.
oh, but could you create variable y that is option of int, and then the ID, whatever this thing is called,
Yeah, I think that's what
is
Jeremy suggested.
-x as well,
Yes.
Yes.
and then it would have the same effect.
Yes.
You could have basically them in two places.
Yep.
Because then they're different options.
So
And
don't
then
rely on the
this will-
name at all. You just rely on the reference equality. of-
So then this will return an array with values 5 and 1, 2, 3, I guess?
Yep.
Yes.
It should.
Okay.
Well, we have to instantiate an array.
But it's having some kind of parse over here.
Sure.
Oh, key has already been added. That's it.
But I mean,
That's
this is what you would expect. Though. You would expect
Yes.
to get 5 and 1, 2,
Yeah.
3 out. Okay.
So
That makes sense.
after invoke is called, like, what is your error handling? Like, do you, if I say dash help, for example, like you do something, right, which means you take care of terminating the application and printing the help, right?
Yes.
And it's presumably some high level thing that comes from .use defaults, where I can say .use help page or something, right?
Yes. It's .use help, and we have a default that probably needs another pass of some work on it, but I did not put descriptions in mine, partially because I don't think that's something our users are going to initially jump to, but arguments, options, and commands all have the ability to add a description.
So this is one, this is one of the places where you can see that even though I didn't define -h in my syntax, this is one of the things that the middleware is providing, the default middleware that you get when you do .invoke right now.
You're going to show us that?
What happens if the user specifies -h as one of their options? Which one wins? Or do they get an error?
Nope, they win. If they specify it, then theirs takes.
So they don't have to, the reason for that is that we don't want to make them then have to go in and not use defaults.
Yeah.
Just because they want control of help, they can just take control of help, so.
Because presumably
I think that's probably the right decision on that.
you work similar to ASP.NET, right? Like the handlers are executed in order, right? And use defaults is the last one, and then they can ask, let somebody before me already define -h and then do nothing, basically, right?
Yep.
So the person that authors this thing and the person calling the method they're both in control on what the order is.
Speaking of which, so that's a question I wanted to ask about the code sample that you were showing like 10 minutes ago now. Yes. How do I provide more than one handler?
Each command has its own handler. So
Each command has its own handler. So if I have
you can.
two handlers, they only differ by small thing. One takes an int and one takes a boolean. Everything else is the same. Do I have to write two commands and create two commands?
Can you be a little more clear on the scenario? Because
Basically,
I think
imagine-
we're putting too much extra lines in your sketch.
Yeah, so let's say this command, and you have an option that is an int -- count. Let's say I have another option that is not an int. Let's say it's a boolean -- something.
Yep.
And I want they are kind of like, maybe I use wrong terminology. Maybe they are not options. You have to specify either boolean or int. Do I have to create two commands, or I can just create one?
The commands are verbs. So commands, they kind of align to, the way that we're thinking about this is that a command will align to one method call. So if you have two different commands, probably they're going to align to two different method calls, just like controller methods on ASP.NET. And each of them can have their own independent inputs.
But are you talking about the same word? So let's say I have blue, and blue could take either an integer or a boolean, but it's still, the user's going to type blue. And so I would expect just one command in that case, wouldn't you? Or would you expect two commands that had blue as their name?
I'm not
So
sure.
I think, I think the scenario is that it's, I know I'm writing on the board, I'm sorry. Blue one, blue, true, okay? You can't do anything else, you have to do one of those two, you can't do anything else.
Right.
But is it gonna be an integer or boolean? So is it blue one or blue two? True, I think we need to think a little bit more about that, it's a good scenario, it gets into these, the way that options and arguments, that's the way I would like to solve that. is to say that your argument has to be one of these two things. How we would express it further into the handler, I couldn't tell you right now, but there's, we're eating away at those things that lie in this middle ground. There's the obviously low level, and there's the obviously users don't want to think about it. And there's a big area in between, and in that area, we have a lot of things around the way validation happens, the way what types are supported, around how options and arguments interact with each other. You've asked a couple of questions on that. I think it's a really good area. It's super complicated, and as I said, my main thing there is that this cannot be expressed in normal help. The way that you're used to seeing help come out from the CLI, you can't express that right now. So we haven't built those broader expectations that have to be part of it, and it should be a unified whole. If we solve it, it should be unified. Otherwise, you figure out your answer to all of those questions. We shouldn't do it halfway, in my opinion, that if we raise something into we're going to make it easy, it's also easy in help, it's also easy in tab suggestion, it's also going to be easy to an accessible reader when we go to that, it's also going to be easy to GUI. Once we have that picture and we know how to express that into some sort, all the things we're talking about, say we're going to have some sort of way to express what we've got out to the rest of the world, let's just say JSON, and none of that is done yet.
Though I think it touches on like the high level opinionated API should have all the properties that you just said. I totally agree. I wonder whether the low level API does not need to be like super basically flexible, parser that can, if I have this scenario, I can represent it. It may be harder to now express help and some other things, but we don't expect majority of developers to be using the low level APIs. The low level APIs are just to unify the high level programming models.
I think that is the case. So this here, from the parser standpoint, this is straightforward. From the handler standpoint, this looks to me a little bit like this rebase example where you effectively have kind of like overloads, right? It's the same verb, but they're a little bit like overloads.
That's why I was asking about why handler is just a property, because I would I had a meta model that you do support it, and the way to implement it is I have two methods. One takes an int, one takes boolean, and I provide two handlers, and then you will automatically select you will detect what the type of the parameter is. And
I think that would actually be fairly straightforward to implement. The validation part is that you need to be able to do interrogate the parse result and say, oh, either this one or that one, or it's a validation error. And then once you know what's inside the parse result, which you can explore using that API, you could effectively implement overload resolution. And that would actually be an interesting approach as well.
It's really super interesting, but we do have a single handler right now. So that's actually a really good comment on the low-level API, and says super handler knows how to take multiple handlers and handle all of that. Can I say handle any more times in that sentence? So
But isn't a single handler logically the most powerful model? Because basically it's you are deciding what you want to do, whether you want to treat them the same, differently, or like you write the logic that says, well, if you specified either continue or board skip or edit undo or do this thing, if you didn't, then I assume maybe I'm not entirely sure. Like, I mean, it's an artificial scenario, right? But I mean, the one thing that I've seen in command line parsing when you say the only differ by type, usually what ends up happening is you have a single logical operation, and then there's just multiple ways you can represent the input. So, for example, in Git terminology, you can specify a branch in different ways. You can either have a branch name, you can have the / ref syntax, you can have these artificial things like head with backticks and other things. So there's multiple syntactic representation, but logically the thing you are parsing is not a string, it's what they call like a ref spec modifier, whatever. So what you would specify here is a ref spec, and then logically when you add your option, you would say option of ref spec, and then you have your own parsing rules where you either accept this string, or that string. But logically, you take it as a singular value. You're not like, it's very rare to have completely different semantics if the only thing that differs is the type name, because it would be a different operation, right? Blue versus
but
red.
I wouldn't have different semantics. It's just in the example, if you again could go back to the example, you see there's a
the rebase example?
The code sample where you provide a handler. There's a method, say hello, below. It's strongly typed. If I had two different, let's say, basically I can pass 1 and true, and maybe I can pass 2 or true, and true means 1. I would have 2 methods like the say hello, and basically say if true is passed, I'm gonna just call the larger method that takes an int, passing 1, and if false is passed, I'm gonna call it with 0. Otherwise, there's a very flexible method that can take an integer.
You've actually inspired me to. John's never heard this before because it just came into my head. I actually think that there's something I'm going to temporarily call a virtual command, which I think we would have a great desire for. So it's a subcommand the user never knows about. So when you have a set of features that belong together, you can have for your ability. So then the integer and the Boolean would be separate. I'm going to call them again just a virtual command because everything's different about them. And one of them you have to have an integer. And it gets to your other question when you have a set of things that belong together and the rebase example. So if we had something called, that I'm just temporarily calling a virtual command, for the user's unaware of this, it allows me to organize help. It allows me to start into a pattern by which the user types exactly the same thing they are today, but we can crack open this set of problems. And so thank you for the things you laid forward, just started the wheels grinding in a way that I actually think we'll be able to crack that one and give good information on both tab completion and help. So if you have any one of these 3 things, then you're in this world.
Yeah.
Okay?
But let me, so first,
Anyway,
I was not
sorry.
even asking about this specific feature. I don't know whether it's useful and whatnot. I have 2 things. One is, as I already said, the low-level API should be very flexible in my opinion. But second one is, I asked this question because that was my mental model initially. When I looked at the code sample, I thought you must have a way to supply multiple handlers, but I don't see it in the API, and I was asking why. And so why did I think that you must have a way to supply multiple handlers? Because if there's only one handler, first, I don't see a reason to even assign this property. Like if there's only one handler for this command, well then I just call, build a command and then call invoke, passing the only handler that you can ever have as an argument. So I would not have a property, literally, if there's only one. And secondly, I did think that the way to write, more full program like this is you write a bunch of these say hello methods. You write a bunch of these say hello methods that correspond to various things that you can do with the console app.
Yep.
The command is kind of like, this is my full syntax grammar. And then I just call invoke, and you will match whatever arguments were passed to the console to the methods that I have, the say hello methods.
Yeah.
So I just
And
wanted-
it seems that now I understood your mental model is this kind of like, I have to create multiple commands and then you just help me call the strongly typed methods, which I thought there's more help there than I think you have right now.
So,
Yeah, I think the model that you're describing sounds more like maybe an ASP.NET model, right? Where you start method first.
Yeah.
And Dragonfruit is a little bit like that too.
Yeah.
And we'll sort of potentially even derive, right now we're deriving the types and the arities and the validation for those types and things like that. But you could potentially even derive this notion of groupings of arguments that are valid together or required together.
Yeah.
And we've had an issue open on this question actually for a little while.
But honestly, like,
So
it seems
is
like
that what you want to do?
Well, except remove the line that says command.
Yeah.
dot
So
handler
these
equals-
guys go away. I wasn't going to delete them just because of
Yeah.
comparison.
Yeah, exactly.
They go away, and this is what you do.
Because
Yeah.
then, yeah, exactly.
That's
By
sweet.
assigning the handler field, it kind of created mental model in my head that you do more than you actually do.
Well, but actually
okay.
no, there's a missing piece of context here, I think.
Okay.
If I have a graph with a whole bunch of commands, right, I'm going to invoke on the root command. So if there's a handler that corresponds to each of the subcommands, which might be arbitrarily nested deep, like in the .NET CLI, .NET add package, I don't know at this point in time whether my args satisfy .NET add package or .NET build. So by saying invoke, I'm saying go invoke the appropriate subcommand per whatever's in these arguments, but I don't need to dig that out at this stage.
I think it's that it's a constructor parameter in that, because if you can only have one per command and it's required, that means it's a constructor parameter.
It's not required. And so
What do you do if you have a command with no handler?
It's invalid. So it's invalid to invoke just, for example, it's invalid in a lot of command lines to invoke just git. I can't just say git. I can do git subcommands, but in .NET CLI, I can invoke just .NET. and that will give me information, right? So if it has a handler, you can invoke that command, regardless of whether it has child commands. If it doesn't have a handler, it's invalid to invoke it. And there's scenarios and aplenty for both of these kind of variations.
Yeah, and then when you keep saying command and subcommand, I'm picturing the .NET CLI or Git or any of the utilities that I kind of hate their syntax for.
Yep.
For the normal, I am a program, I do one thing.
Yep.
I don't care about arg0. I just want my arguments and do stuff. Is that still command? Because I don't feel like I'm building a command at that point.
Yeah.
I'm my meat.
That's the root command, but I think when you're in that space, this is why Dragonfruit is
So I
really
thought root
appealing.
command was for arg0.
It is.
Yeah, so I don't care about arg. I don't care if you renamed my executable. I don't
Yep.
I just want arg1 and beyond processing.
Yeah, so those arg1 and beyond are argument of T or option of T.
Yeah.
But I have to put them on a command, and
Yeah.
it needs a name.
So it would be,
It doesn't
he
need a
said
name.
argument, it could be a
Okay.
command or an argument or an option.
Yeah.
So
One-
let's just say .NET tool install. Okay, so .NET is arg0, tool is arg1, that's a command. Install another
I'm
command.
not .NET.
No, it doesn't matter, you're whatever
I'm-
executable you
I'm
are.
foo.
Yeah,
Your foo.
so your foo.
Okay,
Yeah.
so your foo.blue, so
No,
your foo, so you-
food dash verbose. That is the entirety of
That's the entire-
that is
yeah,
the
okay,
entirety
then
of
it's
our
an
program,
option.
and
So you have
it reads a file off of disk that is a hard coded name, and it computes the nth Fibonacci number based off that.
yeah.
Like
So a good example there would be, so you would need root command in that particular example that was in the Word file. The root command doesn't need a name, so that was kind of one of the things that was a mistake inside of the Word document. But that's one of the distinctions, that the root command doesn't need a name because we know the name based on the invocation. You can supply a name, and that has implications for how we render help. That's the main reason.
Okay.
But do we have to say root command, or can I just say new command?
You can also say new command if you want. They're fungible, but if you say a command is required to have a name, that's really the difference. And then the child, objects that you put in there are defining your options and arguments, which in your case you have one argument, and that would be an int, one argument of int, and you're done. But in that simple case, that's kind of the sweet spot for the Dragonfruit experiment, which is you have a strongly typed main. You don't care about any of the parser objects at all. You don't care about the invoke method at all.
you don't have any special validation. There's a few other things that go in along that line. It's easy to, that app model was really, it was a prototype of proving out the notion of app models. It is extremely useful until you hit the walls. You will hit the walls in most things, and we managed to get through help, which also, and tab completion, or suggestions we want there, and then the basic operation. That's what we got through. We're not, if you want a default value,
Complex
we
binding.
can still do that. Okay, so
Yeah.
default values are supported, but validation isn't. So if you want to only be positive values, you can use you can use an unsigned int, and then you'd get only positive values.
So in Dragonfruit, do you support having multiple overloads, or it's just main?
It's just main.
Could you make it such that I can define several mains, and then from the, well, maybe you can even hide the main,
We do
and
have
kind
it,
of
yeah.
match the overloads, match everything, and just call my.
I think we could do that. We didn't go that next step with
Yeah.
Dragonfruit in terms of the design. We in some ways it was intended to say, what's the simplest thing we can do? Does the underlying API let us build that thing with all of the bells and whistles? And then we kind of stopped there with that. But yeah, that would absolutely be possible. I think the question then is, how do you design the interface? If I'm supposed to use main, I understand main is main. And the jump from string args to strongly typed arguments was pretty intuitive. But multiple mains maybe isn't intuitive. How to represent subcommands, maybe not. How to configure, like the validation rules and things like this. We didn't really go to that next step.
And we think that there's some really interesting other app models, and one of which is, there's a couple ways to do it, but basically having a structure that represents the data you want, and then, and there's a couple of variations of this approach. And so you hand in a complex type, which represents the tree of information that you want, and then you're able to query that later with or without invokes in place within that. So we've done a lot of thinking on this, but in terms of actually getting to the point that the simple one we could put out and not need a lot of feedback on. I think these other app models are actually, going to be opinionated in ways that are really going to desire a lot of feedback, and we haven't yet been at a position for that process. I think we are now. So I think getting some of these back, and also the first round of actually trying to build those, I did, and the entire code base got thrown away because what it showed was that we had some real weaknesses in the underlying API in order to build app models. It was too hard to build the app model. What I built was too crazy hard, and I wrote it, and John would have had a lot of opinions on it. So forgetting that, I didn't throw it away to be mean or because I can't write code. It was because, oh wow, I want to push a bunch of that stuff into other places, and then we haven't gotten back to that question, which would also get into attributed models get talked about a lot, and so we probably need an attributed model. It's the way people think. But it has walls, so we don't want people to hit walls.
I really would love to see the Dragonfruit, but a bit more expanded. Like if it supported overloads, I think it would scale. I don't fully understand the difficulty with nested commands and whatnot, and you have so much experience. I trust that it cannot scale past that point. But I can imagine, I start with a very simple program. It has some arguments, then I want to add an option. Okay, well, I just add an option, keep going. Or then I discovered that I have a kind of branch in the tree, correct? It's not just an option. Well, I just create a second main, and now it has, slightly different types, and you match which one you call, and then I do my thing in the mains. And of course, they wouldn't be mains.
Yeah.
Adding C# overload resolution to Dragonfruit, though, it just sounds like a bad idea.
I don't know. Why?
Well, one, C#'s not the only language. Two, C# overload resolution is like the most complex part of the entire language.
Well, because C# has extension methods and generics and many other the simple, very simple overload resolution was not as bad. C# didn't have overload resolution problems in 1.0, and
Yes,
overloads existed.
Yes, it did. We just didn't expose methods that expose those overload resolution problems.
Well, regardless,
Implicit conversion is the primary issue.
I think for this we could largely over a lot of those nuances are not going to be there for this, so I'm not too worried about that. My concern is actually that I personally would really be hesitant to do that until I also had a really good subcommand story. Because I think that from a user point of view, in most cases, it's the problem with Git. In most cases, for users that are coming to the CLI, they're not going to make the investment in it you've made in Git. That there is a reason that you have either an integer or Boolean in most cases, and stating that as a subcommand. This is what we ran into ML.NET when they wanted to do 20 different options and all these complex things, is that actually what they need to do is group them with a subcommand, and it made a much saner CLI. So I'm fine doing what you're suggesting. I would just want to do it at the same time we had a good subcommand story, so you could choose between it, and I could lay out the reasons you would want to be one or the other, because I think there are good cases for both. But I think the subcommand story sort of is the one to lean into, unless that's too much typing, people really aren't going to want to do that. And then use the other story, the pick an integer or Boolean and call in as strongly typed to those two types, but strings don't work. So I think it's an interesting direction to go, and it's very useful. Thank you.
So one question I have is for the .NET CLI, for example, or same applies to Git. Many of the commands are actually broken into different executables. So can I just get the parse tree, trim out the stuff I care about, and then forward the remaining stuff to somebody else without me having to know the syntax definition of the other stuff?
Yep. Yeah, that was one of the original features of this parser that we couldn't find in other examples out there, was to be able to say, I want strong typing and strong parsing rules over this section of the command line. The rest of it, I just want to forward it as
whatever.
And that is the primary method by which the .NET CLI communicates with MS Builder.
Can you roughly show what this looks like in code? Like, how do I get the parse representation?
It's unparsed tokens, I think, isn't it?
Yep. So here, if we parse the input here.
Sorry, I screwed with you.
That's okay.
Just keep going back.
No worries.
I was going to do something, it didn't work out. Off the top of my head, it wasn't going well. I quit.
While you're doing that, I have a question. Earlier you said you were referring to the string argument that root command took as name, but that's description, not name, correct?
For root command,
I believe it is description, yes.
Yeah.
it probably is. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. You can set the name property on it.
Oh,
And that will affect
For
help,
name.
and it will also give it a hint if you want to parse a whole string input. Say you want to go back through a log file and parse all the inputs, something like this. Or you have a command line, you're writing a REPL or things like this, right? These scenarios are supported.
Type fast, we get 9 minutes.
So here you can see, the command result is the command that was invoked. So if you're in a hierarchy of subcommands, command result will give you that. Root command is the root command result. You can traverse everything from there. What you're asking about, is unmatched and unparsed tokens. So unparsed tokens are things where you said dash dash, and everything after that is unparsed tokens. Right? .NET run dash dash. Everything after that gets passed along to the application that you're building, not the .NET. Right? That's the.
Oh, you mean like dash dash space?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the POSIX operands.
Yep.
Everything after this is operands.
Yep.
Unmatched tokens are things that didn't match something that you defined inside of the grammar for your CLI, but and you can, on a command by command basis, you can say consider these to be errors or don't. So what we're doing in a lot of cases, .NET Build, for example. .NET Build has a bunch of tokens it knows about. It'll parse those, but then it says don't error on unmatched tokens. Anything we don't match, we just forward to MS Build. Right? And that capability allows you to not have to think about it as an end user. I don't have to think about what order these go in. Right? That's pretty important.
The particular case where that's the exception, though, and I think you ended up fixing it somewhat when I talked to you last time, was if you have a option with arity one or more options,
Yes.
then, and that's the last one you specify, then you can get into a confusing case where it interprets everything after that as options rather than
Yes.
as unparsed tokens.
Right.
That sounds like a painful design problem.
That was a wonderful bug, and it is fixed.
Yes.
But that's part. That
Well,
was,
it's fixed for the case where you have a secondary option which starts with dash
Yes.
dash that's unmatched. It doesn't work if you have something that doesn't start with dash dash.
That sounds like a
Because I think that's impossible.
because that's ambiguous. I mean,
Yeah.
the
I think
design's
that's
ambiguous.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
one piece of feedback I'll give for you mentioned when you exceed the complexity that Dragonfruit can do, then you switch to the manual, is have a very good story of this is how you build the tree representing exactly what we were doing for you at that time, because
Or an analyzer that does the automatic.
yeah, like something needs to give you the code of if you do this, you're in the exact same state you were with Dragonfruit, because like I dealt with ASP.NET 2.2 to 3.1 conversion yesterday on a hobby project. That is what I did for my entire day, was figure out how to deal with they changed the model, and all I wanted was the thing to keep working.
You chose the wrong hobby.
Yes.
So-
hobby?
Yes.
I would like to make sure that, first of all, thank you all, it's been great. I would like to kind of know perceptions and next steps. We are on NuGet right now with the API you're saying as a pre-release. At one point we had the word experimental, we removed that, many complaints about that, it's gone. And we're, that's where we're at right now. And do you guys want to visit with us again? Do you want us to, we've got a bunch of ideas here.
Wait, you removed the dot experimental from the end of the name?
Yep.
Okay.
And we've
I'm
got
not using
200,000
package anymore.
downloads since January 4th. It was a complete surprise.
So the one thing that we should talk about is the UX study, I think. I mean, in the end, like, it's your call when you think you're ready to do the UX study. The thing is that depending on how you set it up, the one thing you want to really make sure is that when you have like 4 or 5 scenarios, and then people fail at scenario 1, then very often they can't do 2, 3, or 4, or 5 because they tend to be building on top of each other, at least partially. So you really need to make sure that people have a very high chance of succeeding in scenario 1. Like if they can't find your core type, pretty much the rest of the study is not very insightful anymore. And then the second problem is like, we need to talk about how you get the people, because in the past, and we did this with this external, you get a very mixed bag of people that I'm also not sure is super insightful. But I mean, we know with Twitter and other ways, even on the team, we can have a bunch of people that have never seen the API and give you feedback, which as a first step is always, I think, more interesting than a blog post with comments, because you actually have somebody in depth that you can observe. And very often when you don't know what the answer is yet, you know the names are not ideal, but then when you see what people are actually searching for, you're like, okay, then maybe 4 of our 5 people looked for a name starting with that. Maybe we should have that as a prefix, right? Very often you can actually find answers by just observing people. But then, again, like you will get the study results, and then, you basically know like how far you're off from, can somebody succeed parsing a command line app that takes like 3 arguments, and one of them is a file name, one of them is required, one of them is optional, right? And if the answer is nobody can do that, then maybe your API isn't quite there, right? But and to me, that would be the primary driver for what changes do you need.
And when you say can't find, you mean within reasonable bounds, right? Because it's been really surprising just how little we've had to hold the hands of the people that have used this, even under the poor APIs.
Well, keep in mind that your set is self-selected people that are comfortable with GitHub, right? So like people will copy and paste
and have a deep need to do a parser. That they're going to do a parser. They're going to write it themselves, use a different one, or figure ours out. But the number of questions we've had has been much smaller than we expected.
Sure.
So you're talking about like sit somebody down, somebody who hasn't seen it, not one of you all, and like give them, like 20 minutes to find the.
Your UX study is like usually an hour long, right? And then you have like 5 scenarios, which means usually the first one you expect most people to succeed within 5 to 10 minutes, right? If after 5 to 10 minutes they still don't see light at the end of the tunnel, that's probably pretty bad. And we actually had people bail entirely on scenario 1, but for the most part that was because they were completely unexperienced developers. But like for the most part, like if I would say for any API, if a person trying to find the core entry point in your API after 10 minutes in browsing object browser fails, that's a problem with the API. Because that is the number one thing. Because usually when they find the core type, then IntelliSense will, advertise other concepts to them. They usually are able to then stumble their way at least somewhere, right? If they can't find the core thing, then you're kind of screwed.
So are UserX studies not allowed to look at the sample on the repo?
No, because that's the whole point, right? I mean, like, yes, it is true that once we have documentation and Stack Overflow, people will just copy and paste snippets. But then the question is still, if I show you a snippet that I already wrote, if the names don't make sense to you, it's still a magic, spell incarnation kind of thing where you're like, okay, sure, that works, but I don't know why it works, I don't know how it works.
And I cannot tweak it to whatever I actually want. Because usually sample is approximation of what the user wants, not exactly. But one comment I would have, so if we agree with the philosophy of, we have low-level API that is optimized for flexibility, meaning if I want to write a parser, I will be able to. And high-level API for the opinionated majority, 80% scenario. It seems like you should study the opinionated API, not the low-level API. And today it seems like the study is designed to test the low-level API.
It is, and I think that's insight we got today, and is partially, I think, driven by some thoughts we had in the past that are now out of date around interacting with the BCO. And so I think that we had very good feedback from Mimo and others early on that your API should be more usable than it is. We've done a lot of work there. We've moved it to where we're pretty okay with it, but it's still too hard for a user who doesn't want to think about a parser. You use a library because you don't want to think about your parser. So I think that that's very good. It's very good.
I would say though, like it depends on what low level, right? Low level could either mean, UTF-8 JSON reader with like structs, which is hard to use, or an API that is just slightly more verbose but still easy to use, right? To me, the difference between Dragonfruit and an idealistic version of this is just the amount of characters you have to type. Like a normal user that has, I don't know, a year or 2 years of that experience should not find this code to write, excruciatingly hard.
Or hard to read.
Well, but so now I think what you just said, I detect that you think this is the mainland scenario API. It is not low-level API. So it may be a valid position, but I think we as a team should decide, is the low-level API really low-level for writing higher-level models? Or we expect developers to use it directly to implement their apps? And,
Fair.
And is there 3 levels, which would be unfortunate from point of, there is a very low level, where you're deep in the weeds, and you're doing you're doing intense validation, you're wandering around the tree to do some intense validation. There's some stuff that you can come up with that's going to be low level no matter what. And we're going to have some Dragonfruit solutions. This kind of rests in the middle right now. This, this code. This kind of rests between those 2 right now. And are there 3 layers to this, which is unfortunate, but at the same time, maybe it's the right way for this to behave. where you can use an API, which is what try.net does. But try.net does very little that I know of that goes into the weeds of the really deep stuff. Because try.net right now is the biggest, most complex thing we have that I know of that works against this part.
I suspect if we want the low-level API to be ultimately flexible, like the goal is any syntax that I have in my existing command app, I need to be able to represent it. It will be complicated. You will not it will never be trivial to use and understand. It will literally be a parser for an arbitrary grammar.
But there could
You
be
will be
some
able to write a programming language in it.
static methods or something on an easy to use type that is like, give me your 6 strings here and the method to call when we're done, and like boom, and then you can go look at that. I'm like, oh, this is all the complicated stuff it's doing under the covers. I can go write my stuff in terms of the low level thing instead of this helper.
I think the key point is that even though this gives you access to all the low level stuff, 90% of the code they've shown here isn't the complex case. You can actually this just parses and invokes, and you can actually go in and drill into the individual nodes in the syntax
And
tree.
that worries me, because you see, this is the problem with sometimes people trying to create low-level API and make it simple, is that when code is already written, it all looks simple.
Yeah.
The problem is, if I now want to write the code, I go to the namespace, I see 50 or 60 types, concepts that I cannot understand, and writing code is hard, reading code, yes, if somebody already knows how to do it.
How is that different from Roslyn, where you can either work over the semantic model or the
Roslyn is
lexical?
not a technology for the average .NET developer.
Yeah, and also would say
analyzers too.
And analyzers neither are technology for the average developer to write.
I mean, it is true that anybody who does compiler stuff tends to be more on the advanced side, because you have to have a working model on what the thing does that you're looking at. And any sort of stack analysis, I mean, if you look at FX Corp or CCI, it is a very specialized crowd, right? It's not the average guy. But I would say the one concern I have with command line parsing is that even if you polish Dragonfruit more, I think what will end up happening is that it will be a convenience thing. I think there's too much stuff in the wild that you have to do that will be very hard to express programmatically at that level, which means that a good chunk of our people will have to work with what you consider the low-level API.
But I like the idea that Jeremy had. Basically, you start with Dragonfruit, we add overloads and maybe some other things that we discovered that people want to do in common scenarios.
Right.
And then when you run into a wall, you run a tool on your program, and it generates this code, and then you keep going with the low-level API. I think that would be very nice end-to-end story.
It would be, but I mean, to me, it depends on where you draw the line, right? If you look at SQL command versus EF, there's also two philosophies. Some people just don't like, entity binding with reflection, right? They just want the expressiveness of I write my SQL query behind, I invoke the command. And I would say the core ADO.NET APIs, there's 4 concepts. They are easy to do. They're not complicated to use per se. It just means that, it's tedious because you have to get the values out, cast them the right way, but it's not complicated.
If you are saying
it's
just because we deem some API low level, we shouldn't butcher usability.
Yes.
What I was saying, my main feedback from this overview, which was great, was I think we should focus a lot on the opinionated, built-in, easy-to-use API. Right now, the feature seems to me it's super flexible. It's designed for very powerful tools like our CLI. I think somebody who just writes a very simple console app and wants 3 parameters would be better. I mean, would prefer to have something like the Dragonfruit.
It's just that in my experience, the problem is that the easy things that look most important don't have the longest lifetime.
Unless we do what Jeremy was saying, where you can transition.
And we haven't. I actually think we have a lot of growth that we could do in that space. So I think that just the focus on that is very useful. I think the question about a user study is very interesting. I do tend to think that grabbing some higher-end people from this building to look at the API level and see whether they can figure it out would be useful. I've already looked, there's a rename of something that I'm going to suggest to John after this, so there's been a ton of things that have come out of this that's extremely helpful, but I think giving it to users from the agency that brings us people right now, that's probably not the most useful thing until we do have a better idea of the high-level opinionated APIs. and it's consistent with what we hear already from the community. Dragonfruit has all sorts of good feedback, and people that are using it, command lines have had a very good feedback. We've had 200,000 downloads since January 4th. I do not understand how that happened, to be honest, because we had 300,000 on the old version, and we changed the name, and we've had 200,000 since we changed the name. I'm like, what? So when people are using it, and they're not giving us a lot of feedback, except to say how much the people love Dragonfruit. So every once in a while on Twitter, somebody go, "Oh my gosh, I found Dragonfruit! This is so cool!" You know. And so I do think that that's a really good point. That leaning into where people are already applauding us is a very smart thing to do, and we built to have the capacity to do that. So we should do it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Right. And let's put an end to this meeting. If I find the buttons again. Thanks everybody for
I have a
listening.
question.
And we didn't give Tanner credit. He was